The city was dead long before the tanks arrived. Aachen streets were silent, choked with rubble, smoke drifting between shattered buildings like ghosts searching for a home. Every window was a black hole. Every doorway a question. Every shadow a threat. Allied tank crews hated cities, not because of the buildings, but because of what hid inside them. A Sherman rumbled forward, its engine echoing between the ruined walls. The crew inside could feel the tension in the air. The kind that makes every heartbeat sound too loud. They knew German tanks were dangerous. They knew Panthers and Tigers could kill them from across a field. But here, in the tight, broken streets of a dying city, those weren't the monsters they feared. It was something smaller, cheaper, disposable. A weapon that cost less than a soldier's boots, and could kill a tank worth more than a house. The Panzerfaust, a single-shot tube. Barely more than a metal pipe with a warhead on the end. The Sherman crept forward, turret scanning left and right. The gunner's hands hovered over the controls, waiting for a target he couldn't see. The commander peered through the periscope, searching for movement in the windows above. The loader held his breath. Then it happened, a flash of movement in a second-story window, a streak of fire, a roar that filled the street. The Panzerfaust slammed into the Sherman's side armor, punching through it like it was made of paper. A jet of molten metal tore through the interior, igniting ammunition, fuel, and everything else in its path. The tank erupted in flame, smoke pouring from the hatches, the crew's screams swallowed by the roar of the fire, and then silence. The kind of silence that only comes after violence. The kind that makes every other tank crew freeze. This was the reality of urban combat in late war Europe. It wasn't Tigers that killed the most Allied tanks, it wasn't Panthers. It wasn't even mines or artillery. It was the Panzerfaust. A weapon so simple that even teenagers could use it. A weapon so deadly that Allied tank crews feared every corner, every alley, every window. A weapon that turned every German soldier, no matter how inexperienced, into a tank killer. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the Panzerfaust became the most terrifying threat they faced. In Cologne, Shermans advancing through the city were hit from basements, rooftops, and sewer grates. In Arnhem, British tanks were ambushed at point-blank range by soldiers who fired and vanished before anyone could react. In Berlin, Soviet tanks died by the hundreds as Panzerfaust teams struck from behind barricades, from inside shops, from holes blasted through apartment walls. The weapon didn't need accuracy, it didn't need training, it didn't need finesse. It only needed one thing, a target close enough to hit. And in cities, everything was close. Allied tank crews learned to fear the quiet, they learned to fear the narrow streets where their turrets couldn't turn. They learned to fear the upper floors where their guns couldn't reach. They learned to fear the basements where shadows moved like predators. The Panzerfaust changed how tanks fought. It forced them to advance behind infantry, it forced them to fire blindly into buildings. It forced them to crawl, instead of charge. It forced them to survive in a world where every doorway could be their last. The weapon itself was brutally effective. Its shape-charge warhead could penetrate over 200 millimeters of armor, more than enough to kill any Allied tank from any angle. It didn't matter if the Sherman angled its hull. It didn't matter if the Churchill thickened its plates. It didn't matter if the Pershing finally arrived with heavier armor. The Panzerfaust didn't care, it simply burned through steel, sending a jet of molten metal into the crew compartment, turning the inside of the tank into a furnace. Tank crews called it, the invisible killer. Because you never saw the man who fired it. You only saw the flash, and then the fire. In Aachen, one Sherman platoon lost 3 tanks in under a minute, all to Panzerfausts fired from the same building. In the Hacher Fortune forest, tanks were hit from behind trees at ranges so close the warhead barely had time to arm. In Berlin, Soviet tank commanders refused to advance without infantry clearing every building first. A process that cost thousands of lives. The Panzerfaust didn't just kill tanks, it killed momentum, it killed confidence. It killed the belief that armor alone could win the war. And that was its true power. The Allies adapted. They welded spare tracks to their hulls. They hung sandbags from their sides. They added wire mesh, logs, anything that might stop a shaped charge. But nothing truly worked. The Panzerfaust was too powerful, too simple, too cheap. So they changed tactics. Tanks advanced only after infantry cleared the way. They fired into buildings before moving past them. They avoided narrow streets, they avoided blind corners, they avoided everything that made cities. But the Germans adapted too. They created kill zones, they used civilians' homes as firing positions. They cut holes through walls so they could move unseen from room to room. They waited until tanks were so close that missing was impossible. And when the moment came, they fired. The Panzerfaust became the last line of defense for a collapsing army. It was the weapon of the desperate. The weapon of the cornered. The weapon of a nation fighting street by street, building by building, room by room. But desperation is dangerous, and a desperate soldier with a Panzerfaust was one of the most lethal threats on the battlefield. As the Allies closed in on Germany's final cities, the Panzerfaust claimed more tanks than any other weapon. It turned urban combat into a nightmare. It forced tank crews to fight with fear in their throats and sweat in their eyes. It made every advance feel like a gamble. And yet, they kept moving, through Aachen, through Cologne, through the Ruhr, through Berlin. Because even though the Panzerfaust terrified them, it couldn't stop them. But it left a mark. A deep one. A psychological scar that tank crews carried long after the war ended. The Panzerfaust proved that you don't need a tiger to kill a tank. You don't need a panther, you don't need armor, or engines, or tracks. You only need a soldier. A hiding place. And a weapon that can turn steel into fire. The German Panzerfaust terrified Allied tank crews because it changed the battlefield. It made tanks vulnerable in places they thought were safe. It made every soldier a threat. It made every street a trap. It made every advance a question of survival. But the Panzerfaust's story didn't end with the fall of each city. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the weapon evolved from a battlefield threat into a symbol of a collapsing nation fighting with whatever it had left. Factories were gone. Fuel was gone. But the Panzerfaust could still be made in basements, workshops, and school buildings. It became the last breath of an army that refused to surrender. In the Ruhr pocket, Allied tank crews advanced through industrial ruins. Where every corner felt like a trap, they saw Panzerfaust tubes lying in piles, dozens at a time, as if the ground itself was armed. Some were new, some were rusted. Some were still warm. And every one of them meant the same thing: someone was nearby. Watching. In Hamburg, a Sherman platoon moved through a wide boulevard, confident in the open space. Then a Panzerfaust fired from a third-story balcony. The rocket arcing downward like a falling star before slamming into the lead tank. The explosion echoed between the buildings, and the entire column froze. They weren't fighting tanks anymore. They were fighting ghosts. In Berlin, Soviet tank crews described the city as a maze of fire and shadows. Panzerfaust teams struck from behind statues, from sewer entrances, from holes blasted through concrete walls. Some fired from rooftops. Some fired from basements. Some fired from distances so close the warhead barely had time to stabilize. And when the smoke cleared, the tank was gone. Replaced by a burning skeleton of steel. The Panzerfaust didn't win the war, it couldn't stop the Allied advance. But it forced every tank crew, American, British, Soviet, to confront a terrifying truth. That the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't always the biggest, or the loudest, or the most expensive. Sometimes it's the one you never see, the one fired from the shadows, the one held by someone with nothing left to lose. And that is why the Panzerfaust became one of the most feared weapons of the Second World War. Not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it made every tank crew feel.